In this video, we're going to talk about the benefits of ORCID for funders. There are several benefits that all stem from the three main ORCID API or Application Programming Interface functionalities, which are getting your researchers' ORCID IDs, reading data from ORCID records, and writing data to ORCID records. These essentially provide the foundational building blocks for the other benefits, which are gaining a better understanding of your researchers' backgrounds and activities, confirming your organization's relationship with your researchers, and getting a better idea of your researchers' relationships with other organizations. Improving the integrity of your information workflows, mitigating data errors, and reducing administrative burden, and ultimately the ability to more easily track the impact of your awards and your awardees, even after the end of the grant term. So if this is the structure we're trying to build, how do we get there? Step one, the starting point, is to get your researchers authenticated ORCID IDs. So how do we do that? The ORCID API uses an authentication process called OAuth, which can be embedded into software systems that your researchers interact with. For example, the screenshots below are from Proposal Central, where users have the option to log in using their ORCID credentials. Or once they're already logged in, there's an option to create or connect your ORCID ID. When a user clicks on one of these, they are prompted to log into their ORCID account or register for an ORCID ID if they don't already have one. The researcher is then taken to the ORCID OAuth screen, where they're asked to authorize your organization to access their ORCID ID, which is then automatically stored in your system's database. This way you can know for sure that you have the correct ORCID ID for each person. Once you have your researcher's ORCID ID, you can pull public data from their ORCID record at any time using the ORCID API. For example, if I was one of your researchers and you wanted to find out what publications I had published or additional funding I had received in the last year, you could query the ORCID API to get that information without having to contact me. ORCID members can also pull non-public data from ORCID that is set to trusted parties only visibility. During the OAuth process, when you're getting your researchers authenticated ORCID IDs, you can also get their authorization to read that limited access data from their ORCID records. This is helpful for working with researchers who don't want to have their information publicly visible on the web, but still want to benefit from using ORCID when they work with organizations. Another example of this is systems that allow researchers to pre-populate their profiles, application forms, and progress reports with information from their ORCID records. The example here is from Proposal Central, but Smart Simple also allows for this, and so does Science CV, which is the BioSketch platform used by federal agencies like NIH and NSF. This aspect allows researchers to use their ORCID record as a central place to store their information, and then they can transfer it to other platforms and organizations by just clicking a button, rather than having to manually type everything out each time. So we can see that our stack of benefits is starting to take shape, because when we can uniquely identify our researchers based on their ORCID ID, and we can gather information about their research activities from their ORCID records, we can gain a better understanding of our researchers, their affiliations, areas of interest, potential conflicts of interest, etc. But there are still a few blocks missing here, so let's keep going. The third foundational building block is writing data to ORCID records. So again, during the ORCID OAuth process, you can ask the researcher to authorize your organization to add information to their ORCID record. Proposal Central and Smart Simple, for example, are set up to do this. And this can be enabled through a custom development work also. And this last symbol at the bottom, the green circle with the white circles inside of it, this represents the ORCID Affiliation Manager, which is a tool that's available to ORCID consortium members that allows organizations to add affiliations to their researchers' ORCID records through a CSV upload. The image on the right shows the funding section of an ORCID record that has been populated entirely by organizations in New Zealand, for example. All ORCID member organizations, whether they're universities, publishers, funders, societies, and other groups and platforms, have the ability to write information to ORCID records of their researchers. To give you an idea, this first example is an employment affiliation that was written by the University of Virginia, and the second one is a publication that was written to ORCID by North Carolina State Libraries. Essentially, each organization is asserting information that they can confirm about their researchers. For funders, this is typically funding that the person has received and peer review activity. So here's an example where the American Heart Association has written funding award information to their awardees' ORCID record. These assertions complete the foundation of ORCID's benefits because when multiple organizations are writing to ORCID records, the other organizations that are reading data from ORCID records can more easily confirm their researchers' activities and relationships with various organizations. When we use ORCID records as a trusted source of researcher information like this, it helps to improve the integrity of submission, review, and reporting processes. It also cuts down on the administrative burden of having to clean up data errors, for example. But we're still missing the ultimate top benefit here of being able to better track and analyze the impact of your funding. ORCID really works like an ecosystem, and both researchers and organizations can only benefit from ORCID to the extent that other stakeholders in the ecosystem are also using ORCID. Researchers have the responsibility of getting an ORCID ID, making sure their ORCID record is up to date, and authorizing the organizations they work with as trusted parties. Employers, funders, publishers, and other organizations also have a role to play in reading and writing information from and to their researchers' ORCID records, allowing for that transfer of data. When we take this graphic representation more literally, these are the many types of organizations and platforms that need to be involved with ORCID in order for everyone to really get the most value and ultimate benefits from ORCID. It is very much a dynamic ecosystem. Another important part of the ecosystem that is crucial in reaching that ultimate building block is other PIDs, or persistent identifiers. ORCID is a PID for people, which helps us identify who we're talking about. Then there's ROR, which stands for Research Organization Registry, and provides a unique digital PID to identify research organizations. And there are DOIs, which stand for Digital Object Identifiers, that are PIDs for identifying objects. Most commonly, you'll see DOIs for research outputs like publications and data sets, but there's also a relatively new DOI specifically for grant awards. Currently, these are provided by Crossref, and to distinguish these from output DOIs, we call them Crossref grant DOIs. These are the three main PIDs to know about right now. So going back to the funding example that we saw from American Heart Association, you can see in the ORCID entry that they also have included a grant DOI for this award. This has now essentially linked the researcher to this specific grant through the metadata in their ORCID record. When this researcher publishes their results from the research funded by this grant, they can pass this grant DOI to the publisher, so that the grant DOI can be included in the metadata for their publication DOI, essentially linking research outputs to their funding. This helps us to reach this ultimate benefit of tracking activity and impact. So if we click on this grant DOI, we're taken to the grant landing page, which shows additional information about this grant, including the researcher's ORCID ID in the metadata. And although this page displays Wellesley College as the primary organization, you can be assured that the ROR ID for Wellesley College is also present in the grant DOI metadata. This is an artist's rendition of how all of the different PIDs can be linked together to enable a more clear picture of research activity and impact. We have a blog post that goes more in depth about how the PIDs work together across the research lifecycle, and that's linked down below, so feel free to take a look at that. When PIDs are connected like this, it enables us to gain more insight into activities and relationships that we might otherwise not be able to gather. For example, what you're seeing here is a data visualization based entirely on links between ORCID IDs, publication DOIs, and ROR IDs. The map on the left is showing all of the institutions that have collaborated with researchers that received funding from the Gordon and Betty Moore Foundation. And the screen on the right shows more of an overview of the number of collaborations and the top 5 institutional collaborators. And so that brings us to the full picture here with the foundational building blocks of ORCID member API functionality, providing that level of support for the additional benefits. Ultimately, all of this also supports a fair research ecosystem, which stands for findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. ORCID is especially helpful for the interoperable part, but when used in conjunction with grant DOIs and other PIDs, we can create a more robust research environment where it's easier to follow researcher activity and assess impact.